Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I'm going to be building this guy. Now, you may be wondering, what the heck is this guy? When I first saw this, I'm like, I have no idea what this is from or what it's about, but it looks too cool not to build. This is actually a kit from a game called Sakuro Wars 2, which came out in, I believe, 1998. I read the premise of the movie or of the game, and when I saw that it was listed as a tactical sim and a dating game, or a dating sim, I'm like, okay, I'm not too sure about the game, but this thing looks cool. It's called a Kobu-Kai Ichiro Ogami type in 1/20th scale. This is recently released by Bandai, and apparently Ichiro Ogami is this guy with the spanky looking shirt on there. But regardless of the game and the genre of the game, I just think this thing looks too cool. Apparently the game is set in 1925 Japan, and they have these suits that fight, and these are the good guys, and there's some evil guys that are trying to do something, and they do angsty teen stuff in fighting suits, which is a familiar storyline, and stuff happens. But we don't care about that for this video. What I care about is building this guy. The kit actually features a reasonably detailed cockpit. Here's a few pictures of it here, and I've read comparisons comparing this to machining Krieger kits. I don't necessarily agree with that. While it's the same scale as many machining Krieger armored fighting suits, and the way it opens up in this kind of clamshell fashion is very reminiscent of Hasegawa's Ammo Knight series of kits from that franchise. I think it's just such a different aesthetic, and it's so cartoonish, whereas machining Krieger is it's much more realistic in terms of its presentation. I think the fact that it's a guy in a fighting suit in 1/20th scale is about the only thing in my mind that it has in common with machining Krieger. Now, as the photos and the instructions show, it does have a fairly detailed cockpit. I'm completely ignoring that. It has a figure that goes in there. It's the little Ichiro, what's his name? Anyway, I've already forgotten. It has a fairly nicely sculpted figure, if I can get it, there we go, if I can get it in focus. Fairly nicely sculpted figure, and he sits in there, and his, it's supposed to be he's reaching into these arms, and then his legs go down into a couple of places where there's holes. So if you do decide to build the interior, there's plenty there to work on, and it looks really cool. I'm gonna do it a little different. I'm not gonna paint it in the Canon colors. In fact, I'm going to essentially reimagine this as something entirely different. I'll maintain the look of it, but I want to give it a color scheme and a paint job that's going to look very different from what it would have appeared in the game. There are a few seam lines that I'll have to take care of, like along the arms here. They're not bad. They'll be easy to glue together and sand down. But they are something that will have to be dealt with. There's some seam lines along the legs here, on both the lower and the upper pieces of the legs. There's a few minor gaps that I'll need to deal with up on the main torso. They do a pretty good job of covering up most of the gaps with other pieces, so it's not bad. And Bandai does classify this as an HG kit, high grade kit. So I'm not surprised that there are some seam lines, because that's just typical of high-grade kits. But overall, it's very detailed, and I think the kind of steampunk look to it is going to really lend itself to some bodacious weathering. I'd assembled the model ahead of time so that I could see where the various seam lines were and gaps that I need to deal with. And to proceed, I began the process of disassembling it. Now when you're doing this, it comes apart fairly easily. You want to use some gentle pressure. You don't want to be too rough with it, but just pulling it apart, taking your time, working things back and forth, you'll eventually get it all disassembled. And I broke it down into just some logical components that I felt would make it easier to paint. Once I had it disassembled, I needed to go back and on a few of the parts where there were seam lines, I wanted to glue those in. This process allows me to seal up the gaps, and sometimes it's good enough that you don't need to put additional fillers on. Now note that I'm not being stingy with the glue. I put on plenty of glue here, making sure to keep it out of the articulation. And then once I get the glue on there, I go through and I just give it a good strong squeeze. In many cases, this will extrude some plastic that you simply need to shave that down and sand it away, and you'll have everything ready to go. There won't be any additional steps needed to be taken. In the case of this model, the seams were a little more than what I would normally want to deal with, so I had to put on some filler, which you'll see in a minute. I also glued this hatch shut. This was designed to be opened up so you could see the interior, but I didn't really want the interior being seen, so I went ahead and glued this up so that it wouldn't pop apart when I was later building and painting everything on the model. Alright, I've disassembled the model, and the first thing I want to do is just get rid of some of these seam lines. You'll find those on the legs and the arms. What I've got here is a combination of Tamiya basic putty and Tamiya extra thin cement. I just took a piece of old kitchen tile actually and just put some of the putty on there, and then used a larger brush to dab on quite a bit of the extra thin cement, and it makes for a really good seal right there. That the putty works really well, but the extra thin cement gives it a lot of bite. And what I'm going to do, and it's kind of an old messed up one, but I'm going to take this 240 grit sanding stick, and off camera I'm just going to dip it in some water and just kind of get that water on there and just start sanding away on camera, hopefully. And the wet sanding really does reduce the amount of work you have to do. If I were doing this dry sanding, it would leave a lot more scratches. It would gouge the work a lot more. There would be a lot more powder floating around. So wet sanding really does help when you're sanding gaps like this. But what I'll do is I'll just keep working this down until I get it to where you see how it's just starting to develop that single gray line right there. I'm going to get it so the whole thing is like that. And then I'll go back in with, probably the next one I'll use will be 400 grit, and then I'll finish off with 600 grit. And just do more of the wet sanding until I close up all of those seams. Okay, I've gotten that sanded. I left just a little bit of the sanding putty there because I didn't want to totally ruin that bolt detail. I'm going to go back in and enhance that later. But the acid test when you finish sanding is to simply take your fingernail and run it across the seam. If you don't feel with your fingernail any little bump, because you may touch it like this and you may not feel anything, but it's surprising how your fingernail can detect a lot more in terms of a gap than your fingertip actually can. So I just run it along there like that, and as long as I don't feel any kind of bump, it's ready for priming. All right, I got everything primed and ready for paint. I used just basic Tamiya rattle can gray primer, but I decanted it and sprayed it through my airbrush. Just neat. I didn't do any kind of thinning or anything like that. Worked great. Now if you're saying, well, why would you take the time to decant the primer and then spray it through your airbrush? At this particular time in our world's history, it's a little difficult to get some supplies. So to preserve what I have, decanting primer allows you to spray it much more precisely through your airbrush than you could through the rattle can. So it's a few extra steps, but given the way things are, I thought it would be prudent to do that and save a little bit on the primer. So next, it's time to get this guy painted up. All right, I've got everything painted up. I used Tamiya XF23, which is just a light blue with maybe just the barest suggestion of green to it. The reason I use this color, I'm not going with Canon colors as I mentioned earlier, is I wanted to go with kind of a Warhammer look. If you're familiar with the Space Wolves chapter from Warhammer, I saw a picture online that they've got kind of a light blue armor scheme, and then it had one shoulder was red and one shoulder was yellow, and I'm going to put a decal on here and paint some designs on here. But I just thought it would be interesting to give this Japanese video game steampunk vehicle a Warhammer look. It would just be a little different, so that's what I'm going for. What I want to do now is just paint some details on the model. I want to paint these pipes, these things that go around here, inside there if I can get to it. A little bit on this fan back here. Other places, I want to paint any of the joint kind of pieces. I want to paint those a darker gray color and just get some details done on this model to get it finished up. So let me get my paints ready and I'll start painting. I'm going to be painting most of the details in lead belcher, a silver color, but I always like to undercoat that with a dark gray or black, and I'm going to be using Vallejo Model Color German Gray for this. It's a great color that it gives you the look of being very dark, so it kind of sells a faded black notion to it, yet at the same time it's light enough that if you want to add later shadow effects through washes or other paint or anything like that, then there's plenty of, I guess you'd say, visual space to do so. That's one of the things I always like to do. Is I rarely use pure black or pure white, because when you do that, you kind of back yourself into a corner where you have no ability to add shadows or highlights. But if you go with a very dark gray and an off-white, a cold white, something like that, and then develop some highlights, I think it makes it look better. In fact, when I'm working with white, I find that if I don't do the majority of the painting in pure white, but rather an off-white, and when I say off-white, I mean to your eye it looks white until you hold it up next to pure white and then you see the difference. So we're not talking a lot of difference here in terms of shade. But once you add some white to that, whether it be edge highlighting or some other kind of highlight, then I think it actually makes white look, it makes it pop more. Because if you just have pure white, well, I think the eye gets kind of blown out, kind of like snowblind almost, by looking at the white. But when you add some white highlights, it gives kind of a false sense of shine, and I think that makes white pop a little more. Of course, I'm sitting here talking about white, and there's not a stitch of it going to be on this model probably. But it's just something to keep in mind when you're painting using white and black and all of that, and any color really. I mean, part of the reason I chose this blue color, I didn't decide, hey, I think I'm going to do an ode to Warhammer and paint this guy up as Space Wolf, but rather I started thinking, well, what color do I want to do this in? And I was thinking in terms of contrast for chipping and for staining and things like that. What's going to make those show up very nicely? So my color choice was driven more by a desire to have something that would show the weathering and contrast for chipping. And when I came up with light blue, I said, okay, how can I make up a story behind using a lighter blue? And then it hit me, well, it's this blue that I had chosen looks kind of like the Space Wolves blue. And then at that point, I thought, okay, maybe this is, instead of being something from a video game that's supposedly in 1925 Japan, maybe this is not Warhammer 40K, but Warhammer 10K. And it's something from, still from the future, but with a very different look than we're used to seeing. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm going to continue painting these details like this, and there's quite a few of them, so it'll take me a little bit. But I'll continue painting these, and I'll probably break in a few times and show you a few of the other little things I'm doing. I'm also painting the various joints with this German gray. And when you're doing this, you just take your time and reach down into those areas that are a little harder to get to. You may have to move the joint a little bit, like at the knee, I'll have to move that, you know, into a bent position, paint everything I can, and then once it dries, move it back and paint it, you know, what's left. But you just go at this carefully, and then what I'll do is anything that I miss when I get to the stage of weathering, I'll just add in an acrylic wash, very dark acrylic wash, and I'll just flood that area. And the main goal in that is just to get everything that's looking like an interior part, just getting it looking dark. So that's kind of my strategy when I'm painting joints like this after assembly. All right, I've got these various tubes and hoses and things painted black, or German gray rather. I didn't glue these on, and I'm glad now I didn't, because I could pop them off and get behind where they go and get them fully painted without having to do too many gyrations to reach in there and get paint all over everything. And then I went in and painted just the various joints, the bottoms of the feet, the frame part of that, the legs, and just a few other pieces. I based those all in the German gray. All right, now I'm going to take some of Citadel's lead belcher, one of my favorite colors. If you've watched many of my videos, you know that I liked my lead belcher. But all I'm going to do is, I've got it thinned down here in my palette, and I'm going to get most of it off of my brush like that. And what I want to do, let me pop down my optivisor so I can try and see this, so that you can see it on camera and I can see it while I'm working. But all I want to do is run this color along the top of these tubes. Now these on the side, I'll go a little further down the side like this. And I apologize if this is out of focus, because I'm leaning over at about a 45-degree angle working around the camera. But I'm going to continue painting this. Now, yeah, I could just paint this all lead belcher and then go back and put in a wash. But I think part of the value of doing things this way is its practice. You wouldn't work so hard to paint fine lines if you were just covering that up. So this is a bit of practice for me, and I think it's important when we're building to just look for opportunities to do the things that are a little harder. Not inefficient, not in a way that is just kind of like beating your head against a wall, but rather, if you know that painting fine lines and fine detail is something that's a challenge for you, well, do that a little more and it won't become a challenge. And also, if it's something that maybe in the particular genre you're working in or the models you're working on, you don't do a lot, then when you do get an opportunity, take those opportunities to keep those skills fresh. I know when I was in the Army, I was a very good rifleman. I always scored very high when we went out to the rifle range. But I took every opportunity I could to go back out there, even though I consistently did well, so that I made sure that that skill was preserved because, well, it was kind of important for that job. So anyway, I'm going to keep doing this. And notice, like right here, there's some area where I got some black there. There's a little bit along there. Those are areas that once all of this is dry, I'll go back and touch up with the Tamiya XF23. Just give it a little dot of color there, and that'll correct those. I could leave that, and then just later weathering will make that look like a chip, but I'll probably go and correct it just for the sake of doing it. I'm only going to be using one decal on this model, and that's going to be on this yellow shoulder armor. So I want to make sure there's a good smooth surface for that decal. So I'm just going to give this a quick brush paint of gloss coat. Now this is Future gloss coat, Future Clear, the floor polish. You can use whatever gloss coat you want. There's that piece of trash that keeps coming off the brush. The thing about painting on gloss coats, when you're brushing it on, you want to go a little heavier so that it levels out nicely when it dries. You may get a little pooling here and there, and if you do, like I see just a tiny spot of it right there, you want to unload your brush and just go in there and paint that down. But a good heavy coat of gloss will self-level much better than a light coat, because as I've said before, if there's no self, it can't self-level. So you have to put enough for it to self-level. But I'll let that dry, and I still haven't decided on the decals, so I'll probably wait and just pick one that I'm happy with after I think about it for a while, and you'll see what that is in the next episode. All right, I think I'm going to call this a video. I've got all of the base painting that I wanted to do completed. I have all the little details on that I want. They're still drying, so I don't want to assemble it yet at this point, because there's no kind of clear coat or finish over anything except this one piece of shoulder armor. If I start handling it a lot, trying to put it back together, pull it apart, those kind of things, I stand a pretty good chance of damaging the paint, and I don't want to do that. I'll leave it at this state for now. I may do, once it dries, I may give it a matte varnish or a satin varnish to prepare it for the weathering, and also to protect it so that I can assemble it to take a thumbnail for this video. So if you see the thumbnail for this video and the guys together and you're like, hey, wait, at the end he didn't put it together, that's why. I just don't want to damage the paint. But I've had a lot of fun putting this together and doing this paint, and I'm really kind of excited about this scheme. I think it'll be something very different to combine genres here, and should look pretty cool. But in the next video, I'll go into weathering this, and I am planning on this guy being weathered very heavily. I'm going to make good use of all of these bolt details and things like that. There's going to be rust, there's going to be dirt, there's going to be streaks, there's going to be chipping. This one I'm going to deliberately go overboard on the weathering, because I think it'll just be so much fun to do so. And it will be a great way of demonstrating various weathering techniques. So be sure, and this is a great segue, huh? Be sure and click on that subscribe button down there somewhere, wherever it's at. And there's a little bell icon. Please do hit that bell. I mean, please subscribe, but please do hit that bell icon. I'm trying to grow the channel, and that looks good to YouTube. The more people that not only subscribe, but hit the little bell so they can be notified of every video, that really does help. So please be sure and do that. In addition, there are links down there below, and that's to the various social media platforms that I am on. So if any of those are something you use, please do follow me there, and I would love to hear from you. I love getting comments on the videos, comments on the social media, people who go to the blog, the link for that is down below, and contact me through the Contact Us form. That really means a lot to hear from people and hear techniques that you've got and hear things that you're doing, so that I can learn new things, because this is all kind of a learning process for all of us. So please don't ever hesitate to get in touch with me. Share a technique, ask a question, tell me a story of a kit that you really like, whatever. I love talking modeling, so please take advantage of that. And finally, there is a link down below for Patreon, and I do have a Patreon account. It's how I am able to do what I do, because otherwise we couldn't afford for me to model at the pace that I do with the materials that I have, and keep this going. So Patreon is a huge part of that, and if you would consider that, I would be grateful. Just click on the link to Patreon and it'll show you all the various levels that I have available for supporters and the benefits that come with them. So please take a look at that. And if you are already a patron, thank you so much for doing so, because it really, I say this a lot, and I may sound like a broken record and it gets old, but it's really something that not only just benefits me in this hobby, but it benefits my whole family, because the patrons make the hobby happen for me, and without causing any problems for our finances within the family. I mean, like I've said, I wouldn't be able to do it like I do it. So you guys are really making a difference for us and for me being able to produce this kind of content, which I hope you enjoy seeing. I really do. And so anyway, take a look at Patreon, take a look at those links below, and maybe there's something there that you can connect with. Well, as always, I want to leave you with a final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.